Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our program with The Believer, a literary celebration. And we're very pleased to welcome all of the authors who'll be reading various works from The Believer, one of the Bay Area's most eclectic and popular cultural and literary magazine. Before we begin, I'd like to find out how many of you are new to the Mechanics Institute. Who's never been here before? Wonderful, welcome. We'll come back on Wednesday at noon and take the free tour. You'll be able to see our really incredible library on the second and third floors. We have an international chess club, which is right down the hallway. And also you'll get a little introduction to our history. Of course, we were founded in 1854, so we have had a long life here in the city. Also, you'll find out about our programs, which include programs such as this, author events and panel discussions. The library has a wide array of book clubs and writers groups. And of course, the chess club has ongoing chess tournaments and classes. So we hope that you'll become a member and join us and become part of our ever-growing and vital cultural family here at 57 Post Street. So now I'd like to introduce our host of the evening, Ted Gioia, who has curated a whole series here for us. He is the curator of the Rising Writers series, which has been going on all year with great success. Ted is a critic, and he lives here in San Francisco. And his work has appeared in The Believer, The American Scholar, Los Angeles Review of Books, It's Nice That, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. Currently, he's writing a book of essays about the evolution of California culture framed through its food and the arts. And Ted is also the former Partnerships Director of McSweeney's. Also, as I mentioned, with Rising Writers, we're going to be starting up that series again in 2020. He is also the founder of the upcoming site Forktongue, interviewing food critics on the future of food writing. So please welcome Ted Gioia.
Thank you so much. I'm truly honored to be hosting this event for The Believer. I worked at The Believer for a couple years when I first moved to San Francisco, and it was a whirlwind. I showed up one day, said I'd work for free, and then launched on an odyssey that took me everywhere from fact-checking the Church of Satan's IMDb page to writing headlines for Robert Coover interviews. But for those that don't know, I really think The Believer is the best literary magazine in the country today. The magazine's eclectic, omnivorous, experimental, yet genuinely heartfelt and sincere in the best possible way. You could find a review of a David Lynch film next to a review of a Billboard ad. You'd see an interview with Questlove beside an interview with David Foster Wallace. It's a magazine about taking chances, about truly nurturing young writers, and I think ultimately a magazine about courage. One of the many things I did when I was working at The Believer was write a mission statement. I doubt they still use it, but a few of the words, the lines still stay with me. We wrote that the mission of The Believer is to champion creators, to invite curiosity and experimentation, to celebrate the oddly absorbing and the absorbingly odd. Against conventional judgment, we dare to believe. And at this moment in the literary culture, I think we all need a little daring and a little belief. So it's my honor to kind of offer a little bit of a tour through the archives of this wonderful magazine. And we also have Daniel Gambiner, who is the managing editor here, so please come up and talk to him afterwards. Buy an issue. But for tonight's reading, we have 5 great writers who are gonna read one of their favorite pieces from the magazine's archives to give you a little flavor of the Believer charm. And our first writer is Esme Weijun Wang. She is a novelist and essayist. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling essay collection, The Collected Schizophrenias, for which she won the Gray Wolf Nonfiction Prize, Her debut novel, The Border of Paradise, was called a Best Book of 2016 by NPR and one of the 25 best novels of 2016 by Electric Literature. She was named by Granta as one of the best young American novelists in 2017 and won the Whiting Award in 2018. So without further ado, Esme.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm going to be reading from a piece called The End of Evil by Sarah Marshall. And if you want to hear, or if you want to read the rest of the piece, it is available online in the Believer archives. The crowd was growing. Hundreds had gathered across the road from the prison, bundled against the midwinter chill and warming themselves with the clever vendors' coffee and donuts. Though dawn had not yet broken, the ground was littered with beer cans. Celebrants lit sparklers, strangers joined in song, and children did their best to stay awake. One family, the Cochrans, told reporters they had left their home in Orlando, Florida, at 2 o'clock in the morning so they could be sure not to miss the festivities. They had brought their 6-year-old twins, Jennifer and May Nicole, because, Mrs. Cochran said, I thought it would be educational for them, kind of like a field trip. The throng had arrived as if from nowhere. The day before, there was only one man waiting outside Florida State Prison. His name was George Johnson, and when the camera crews found him, he was standing beside the trunk of his car, selling T-shirts for $10 apiece. Do you think it's appropriate, a reporter asked him, to be making money off some man's execution? I don't see why not, George said. The broadcast cut him off. Everybody already knew what he did. Within hours, George was doing a brisk business. Printed in the bright red of cartoon blood, his T-shirts showed a sweating, wide-eyed man strapped into an electric chair, staring out at the viewer with an expression that managed to seem both helpless and imperious. The words splashed above him read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." The shirts were selling particularly well, George said, among women. Ted Bundy had been on Florida's death row for nearly a decade after receiving 3 death sentences in 2 separate trials for the 1978 murders of 3 victims who could be called young women, but could also just as fairly be called girls: 20-year-old Lisa Levy, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, and 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Now, in the early hours of January 24th, 1989, it seemed Bundy's time was finally about to run out. When Ted Bundy was apprehended in Pensacola in the early hours of February 15th, 1978, 6 weeks after he escaped from a Colorado jail, the FBI had already publicly linked him to 36 murders across 5 states. In the ensuing decade, both the random speculations of onlookers and the educated guesses of law enforcement often pushed the number far higher. Many said it had to be 100 or more, and cited Bundy's own enigmatic statement to the Pensacola detectives who had questioned him about the FBI's claim. He said the figure probably would be more correct in the 3 digits, Deputy Sheriff Jack Poitinger said. Ron Holmes, a criminal justice professor who interviewed Bundy on 2 occasions, claimed that the total was 365 and that Bundy had raped and killed his first victim at the age of 11. Ted Bundy is not insane, Holmes told the press. Ted Bundy knows the difference between right and wrong, but Ted Bundy does what he wants to do when he wants to do it. Holmes hadn't taped either of his interviews with Bundy, but he didn't need that kind of proof to convince people of what they already wanted to believe. Ted Bundy was everywhere and nowhere, guilty of everything because he had admitted to nothing. Nothing, that is, until the last few days before his scheduled execution. Then, as Florida restaurants put up signs advertising Bundy fries and Bundy barbecues, and vendors stocked up on electric chair-shaped lapel pins, Bundy said he was ready to confess for a price. He would describe every murder he had committed, but only in exchange for a stay of execution. He needed a few more months to tell the whole story, he said, but he was willing to meet with investigators from around the country to show that he was serious. He would answer their questions if they would advocate for his life. Florida Governor Bob Martinez remained unmoved. Justice has been on hold for a decade, he announced, and it's about time that Ted Bundy paid for his crimes. To the viewers across the country who tuned in to watch the countdown to Bundy's execution, it was hard to imagine that the man whose name had become synonymous with the term psychopath deserved to draw another breath. Ted Bundy is to serial killers, Bundy's post-conviction lawyer Polly Nelson once wrote, as Kleenex is to disposable handkerchiefs, the brand name that stands for all others. In America, in the decades since Ted Bundy's crimes, captures, trials, and resulting infamy, the term serial killer has itself become a kind of brand name for evil, one promising an ever-familiar fable about inhuman darkness disguised in human form, appearing out of nowhere and terrorizing humanity until humanity can destroy it. If it should ever occur to you to relate this to anybody, Ted Bundy told one of the detectives he confessed to in the hours before his death, you can tell them that I get no secret joy or pleasure out of it, that my own special kind of hell and madness that I lived in 10, 20 years ago was as wrong and as terrible as it could be, and I'm sorry. Is it possible to see this apology as genuine? Is there any sense in trying? Ted Bundy is the textbook psychopath who shows us how to recognize the evil in our midst. His story is the story we all know, and yet the longer you listen to it, and listen not just to the legend, but to the people who knew Ted Bundy, and even to the man himself, the more you will find yourself hearing the story of a man who was not a mastermind, was not a genius, and who seems to have understood as little about what motivated him as the people around him did. As you draw closer to its center, and closer to the demon core, you may begin to find that the longer you spend inside this story, the less sense you can find. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our second reader is Jesse Nathan. Jesse Nathan's poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Boston Review, The Nation, and elsewhere. He lives in San Francisco and is the poetry editor of McSweeney's.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to be in this beautiful space. One of the original ideas behind The Believer was to create a magazine that promoted reading, the reading of books. I remember one of the initial essays, a manifesto of sorts, urged everyone to read hard, to read widely, constantly. And so in that spirit, I wanted to read one of my favorite book reviews, a short book review by the poetry editor of the magazine, Dominic Luxford. It's a book review of one of my favorite books of poetry, Sir O'Reilly's Romy's Order. And before I read the essay, I'm just going to read you a few lines from the book so that the essay makes a little bit of sense in that regard. I'll just read from the opening lines of the book from a poem called Flint Chant. Imagine yourself in the South Carolina lowlands. Once upon a time, a ditch pipe got left behind Azalea Industrial, back in the woods, backing onto the Ashley, where old pitch pines and loblollies grow wild. A mild pesticide mist was falling and mingling with paper mill smell and creosote oil the morning he found it. The boy shook and sheltered in its mouth a while, hoo, hey-o, and bent and went on in. It was like a cave, but clean. He C-curved his spine against one wall to fit, and humming something, sucked his shirt tail. He tuned his eyes to what low light there was and knuckle-drummed a line along his legs. What the boy called inside Oku called him back. He was hooked, right quick, on the well-bottom piece of the pumicy concrete and how it sounded in there and resounded, tight-curled as he had to get, like a cling shrimp one day, a pill bug, a bass clef, a bison's eye, an abalone, ocean ear, antler arc ant apostrophe another, sure as clocks, a cool, clear undercreek would rise and rinse him through and runnel free. Hanging in a green pine outside were sun heat and smaze and BB fire and mosquito abatement. Inside, there were water limber words and a picture, noisy nave, shades of shade. This is Dominic Luxford's clear-eyed and, I think, wonderful little review of the book. In December of 2001, and the review, by the way, was published in issue 75 in October of 2010. In December of 2001, Atsuro Riley stepped onto the poetry scene, seemingly from out of nowhere, with a nearly perfected style. These were poems you would expect at the height of a poet's career, poems in which previous efforts were transcended and everything mysteriously came together. Almost 10 years later, Riley has released one of the most exciting and distinctive debut collections in many years. The main themes in Romy's Order revolve around the essentials: family, food, birthplace, ethnicity, childhood exploration, and the natural world. Our guide is Romy, who, like Riley, is from the South Carolina Lowcountry, and who, also like Riley, is of mixed descent. Romy's mother is Japanese, and his father, usually shown with a bottle near at hand, and at one point seen, quote, hound dog digging buried half-pints from the woods, is Caucasian American. Romy is a sensitive, imaginative, sometimes scampish young boy. He observes, considers, and explores, and these experiences seem to make sense to the extent that they find articulation, especially articulation through the sounds and rhythms of language. A book of perceptions, Romy's Order is almost purely descriptive. The poems almost completely grounded in the sensory, the material. Quote, our in-warped wooden porch door is kick-scarred and splintering, Riley writes. The hinges of it rust cry and rasp in time with every tailspin wind and jam slap and after slap and shudder. The relation of object to locale, to cadence, to mood, the relation of language to the actual experience of perception is 100% pitch perfect here. Over and over again, Riley simply nails it. And this uncanny ability to convey the sensory experience, the feeling tone of objects and phenomena, extends outward into the entire physical environment. If a landscape or region could be onomatopoeic, if it could speak, had its own idiolect, the South Carolina Lowcountry might very well sound like these poems. Romy's Order opens with an epigraph from one of Riley's most evident influences, Seamus Heaney. The epigraph goes like this: an order where we can at last grow up to that which we stored up as we grew. Riley echoes the line a couple of pages later at the beginning of Picture. Quote, "This is the house and jungle-strangled yard I come from and carry." It's a line that, because of Riley's deft ability to convey the world he comes from, now an inner landscape, a sensibility, feels immortal by the end of the collection. Thank you. Yeah. Get this book.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Our third reader is Anisse Gross. She is an award-winning freelance writer and member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto. She received an MA and MFA from San Francisco State, where she was honored with the Graduate Award for Distinguished Achievement. Her journalism, criticism, and editorial work has been featured in the New York Times, TheNewYorker.com, The Guardian, The Believer, the San Francisco Chronicle, Lucky Peach, and elsewhere. So, Anisse.
So I think there was an anecdote that David Foster Wallace used to answer his phone by saying, "Distract me." And so when Ted asked me to pick something from one of my favorite magazines, and it was a great distraction from doing my own work. And I didn't pick something that was my favorite. I actually picked something I'd never read. And this is an essay about bassoons being underrated. So if at some point during this reading, someone wants to volunteer their impression of a bassoon sound, that might be great. I tried, but my voice is more sort of high and nasally. All right. There was a lot I didn't know about bassoons when I first took one home from 6th grade band class. I didn't know that the bassoon would earn me a college scholarship, or that I'd spend the first 10 minutes of every subsequent job interview explaining what the instrument is. Yes, it's related to the oboe, but it's not the same thing. No, it's not quite as tall as I am, ha ha. I had no idea that the bassoon is known as, quote, the clown of the orchestra, or that there was anything funny about it at all. I didn't know that in German it's called the faggot, that stoners think it looks like a giant bong, or that dads and uncles claim that it sounds like a fart. But the bassoon is funny, or so I'm told. Go to a children's concert at any orchestra hall in the country, and when the instruments are introduced, the bassoonist will play the bouncy theme from Paul Dukas' Sorcerer's Apprentice, and the conductor will talk about Mickey Mouse. If you're lucky, the bassoonist will even use his instrument to blow up a balloon fitted to the end of the bell. The same trick, performed with condoms, is a sure hit at music school parties. And you might think that you don't know what a bassoon sounds like, but chances are that you've heard it on television, in dopey commercials for pet food and paper towels, and in laugh track sitcoms when someone is spying on his next door neighbor or sneaking into his girlfriend's apartment. Most recently, the bassoon has made some wry cameo appearances in HBO's Curb Your Enthusiasm, usually to punctuate Larry David's most awkward and ill-advised conversations. In the Christmas episode from season 3, Larry fears that he has accidentally tipped his waiter at the golf club twice and decides to confront him about it. That's so classic. A relentlessly cheerful version of Deck the Halls, heavy on the flute, plays on a loop in the background as the waiter politely tries to explain that he has been tipped only once. Larry, of course, presses him. So you're saying I only tipped you once? He asks, long after he should have walked away. Yes, says the waiter very quietly. Do you want your first tip back? No, says Larry. Then after a beat, I'd like my second tip back. As the waiter deadpans, there was no second tip. The Deck the Halls music finally stops. Close up on Larry as he nods suspiciously. Cue new music, solo clarinet, a slow, tentative, slinking melody. I'm gonna try this. Dum, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. That's how it sounds, right? Larry squints one eye and stares at the waiter. The waiter stares back, alternating close-ups of their two faces. Finally, when we think we can't stand it any longer, the bassoon enters, interrupting the clarinet with 4 bright, reedy toots. Is that how it sounds? Oh my God, that's so bad. Someone with a really good voice. I feel like Jesse might have a better bassoon. Whereas the clarinet was sneaky, mischievous, the bassoon is tactless, buffoonish. It's the sound of a guy slipping on a banana peel. I've long had a proud habit of elbowing unsuspecting movie dates to alert them to the sound of the bassoon. But lately I've begun to feel a bit embarrassed about all this clowning around. The bassoon so rarely gets to build the suspense. It's the instrument that gets called in to cut the tension with a joke. This seems like fun at first, but there's little dignity in constantly being called upon to accompany pratfalls and missteps. Surely this is not the best we bassoonists can hope for. We don't, after all, spend so many days of our lives locked away in dank practice rooms because we want people to be convulsed with giggles when we perform. And in fact, when we play most pieces, the great solo and orchestral works that have never been featured in cartoons or commercials, no one laughs at all. On its own, the bassoon probably isn't any funnier than a piano is sad or a drum is angry. No, if the bassoon sounds silly in the movies, it's because someone, some composer long ago, probably, wrote the bassoon a funny line or two, and since then, everyone has been copying him. My fantasy is to travel back in time, find this guy, and club him on the head with my bassoon case. Or at least beg him to reconsider. Let's talk about flatulence. There are those who argue that, historical precedent aside, there is something intrinsically funny about the bassoon, and that something is the instrument makes rather convincing fart sounds. I must admit that there is a kernel of truth in this rude comparison. The bassoon's pitch is right, both for tense tenor farts and for deep bellowing bass ones, and its double reed allows for a particularly explosive attack. It's true, as David Spear argued while we both giggled like school kids, that a trombone or a tuba in its staccato mode can also elicit a plausible sounding toot. But surely our farts are better, I thought. Ooh, yes. But surely our farts are better, I thought, my pride suddenly wounded. Because of its double reed, the bassoon is equipped to pop out some of the cleanest, shortest notes in the whole orchestra. And composers have come to depend upon its reliably crisp staccato. But let's not forget that the bassoon's smaller cousin, the oboe, is also a double reed instrument, equally capable of pecking out short notes. And yet no one says the oboe sounds like a burp. In fact, the oboe often plays the most expressive singing lines of the whole wind section. In cliched film scores, it foreshadows a sad turn. The love affair will end, the soldier won't come home from war, the mother will succumb to cancer. And what the fart enthusiasts forget is that the double reed, in addition to producing a great staccato, also makes it possible for oboists and bassoonists to play very long, tender phrases on a single breath. Efforts to describe the sound of the bassoon have left otherwise sensible people tongue-tied. Frank Zappa once said it had a, quote, medieval aroma. In one of my favorite bungled descriptions, the critic Cecil Gray wrote, "The bassoon in the orchestra plays the same role as gorgonzola among cheeses, a figure of fun." Actually, the bassoon can be the most romantic and passionate of instruments, and gorgonzola the finest of cheeses, but they must both be treated properly. I'm not sure quite what he's getting at here, cheese, music, odor, but it seems to have something to do with versatility. Yes, the bassoon can sound bouncy and mysterious, as in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, or in The Hall of the Mountain King, but it can also sing like a diva, as in Mozart's Porgy and More aria from The Marriage of Figaro, or dance seductively, as in the second movement from Korsakov's Scheherazade. Way back when the bassoon was just starting to emerge as a solo instrument, the composer and bassoonist Etienne Ozzy asserted that it has something in common with the human voice. Sometimes I like to imagine that Ozzy was right, and that this uncanny similarity is what makes the bassoon sound so plaintive in the fourth movement of Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony, or so achingly nostalgic in the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth. It might also be what makes the March to the Scaffold sound so macabre. We're hearing our own voices distorted and perverted by death. Berlioz wrote that the bassoon's timbre, totally lacking in nobility, has a propensity for the grotesque, which must be borne in mind when giving it prominence. But he also wrote that the character of its notes has about it something painful, complaining, and wretched. There shouldn't be anything funny about the grotesque, the painful, and the wretched, and yet, of course, there is. Much of the most wonderfully creepy writing for bassoon is hair-raising because of the way it marries the comic with the tragic, the everyday realm of the living with the shadowy world of the dead. In Tchaikovsky's opera, The Queen of Spades, for example, what starts as a lighthearted staccato bassoon motif begins to sound downright frightening as it follows the title character, an old crone, into hell and back. But is the bassoon uniquely grotesque? Could Tchaikovsky have just as easily chosen another instrument to play the same line? We might side with Ozzy and imagine that the bassoon's voice-like quality gives it a special power to remind us of our own fragile mortality. The same trick might also be paired with Bernstein's theory to explain the bassoon's role in musical humor. It sounds so much like a human voice, but without words and no body attached. How incongruous. We don't expect to hear such a sound coming forth from the back of the orchestra. It jokes, it sings, and sometimes it even seems to die. We laugh, finally, because the bassoon reminds us of ourselves. Thanks.
One of the amazing things about The Believer is you can just pick up and go into an archive and find an amazing piece about bassoons. And yeah, that's the beautiful generativity of The Believer's opus. Our next reader is Colin Winnett. Colin Winnett is the author of Revelation, Animal Collection, Fondly, Coyote, and Haint Stay. His novels have been translated into Italian and English. His latest novel, The Job of the Wasp, was published by Soft Skull Press in 2018.
Hello, everyone. How's it going? It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. It was so nice that Jesse mentioned The Believer's sort of, well, you put it so well, the project of it to encourage us to read, or to read hard, I guess, which I remember that sort of introductory piece years ago. And part of how it does that, or has done that in my life, is not only in giving me years and years and years of things to look at and think about and read that I hadn't discovered, but it also found ways of deepening my connection to things that I was already felt familiar with. And so I'm going to read a sort of selection from June 94, from November 1st, 2012. And I'll just, so there's The Believer and there's Maurice Sendak, and I'll just sort of put a lilt at the end of the question so you know that was The Believer. Do you miss the city, living out here? I don't really like the city anymore. You get pushed and harassed and people grope you. It's too tumultuous. It's too crazy. I'm afraid of falling over in New York. People are all insane and talking on machines and twittering and twattering, all that. I'm here looking for peace and quiet. A yummy death. A yummy death? I'm just reading a book about Samuel Palmer and the ancients in England in the 1820s. You were so lucky to have William Blake. He's lying in bed, he's dying, and all the young men come, the famous engravers and painters, and he's lying and dying, and suddenly jumps up and begins to sing, "Angels, angels." I don't know how the song was. And he died a happy death. It can be done if you're William Blake and totally crazy. Are you happy now? My friends are all dying. They have to die, I know that. I have to die. But 2 friends died last week. I was completely broken by it. One was a publisher in Zurich. I loved him and his wife. It's the loneliness that's very bad. They're doing what is natural. If I was doing what is natural, I would be gone, like they are. Where did your curiosity and imagination manifest? My brother, who was 5 years my senior, a wonderful, wonderful brother, and my sister. They stood guard over me. They were like the parents I wanted, and behind them, the parents I really had. I mistreated my parents because I didn't understand their troubles, and then it gets too late. Did your family know about your partner? Yes and no. They didn't want to know him. They never knew I was officially gay. Of course they knew, especially my father. My mother was so bewildering and strange and lived in another world. I don't know what she knew. Nothing was said, but if something had been said, I would have been thrown out of the house. Don't ask, don't tell. And yet they met him and respected him. Strange. I remember sitting in my studio working, and my sister was visiting me, and I heard her weeping, and I said, "Natalie, what's the matter?" And she said, "I'm just thinking of my little brother sitting there drawing pictures, and what's going to happen when I die? You're going to have no one." And I said, "Wait a minute, I have Eugene." No, she said, "You've got to have a woman to take care of you." No wonder in your work you take a stance against whitewashing. Exactly. I refuse to lie to children. I refuse to cater to the bullshit of innocence. Do you make any concessions to times changing? Do you worry that children now are different from how you were then? No. There are rich kids, there are poor kids, that's the only difference. Some kids get more than others. I don't really like all kids, I'm not sentimental. If I'd had a kid, I would have had a daughter. They're kinder than boys, smarter, more intuitive and sensitive. If you have to have a kid, you might as well have a daughter. What kind of things do children write to you about? Usually it's awful, because they don't feel the urge to write themselves. A few of them do, but usually it's, "Dear Mr. Sindak, Mrs. Markowitz said would you please send a few free books and 2 drawings?" When they write on their own, they're ferocious. After Outside Over There, which is my favorite book of mine, a little girl wrote to me from Canada. "I like all of your books. Why did you write this book? This is the first book I hate. I hate the babies in the book. Why are they naked? I hope you die soon. Cordially, ... Her mother added a note. "I wondered if I should even mail this to you. I didn't want to hurt your feelings." I was so elated. It was so natural and spontaneous. The mother said, "You should know, I am pregnant and she has been fiercely opposed to it." Well, she didn't want competition, and the whole book was about a girl who's fighting against having to look after her baby sister. You've never liked being called a children's illustrator. I never started out as a children's book artist. What is a children's book artist? A moron, some ugly fat pipsqueak of a person who can't even be bothered to grow up. That's the way we're treated in the adult world of publishing. I remember a publishing party 1,000 years ago when we were invited, people from the children's book department, and someone said, "Oh, you stay up so late." Stupid man. But that's the attitude in this country. I'm an illustrator. I have to accept my role. I will never kill myself like Vincent van Gogh, nor will I paint beautiful water lilies like Monet. I can't do that. I'm in the idiot role of being a kiddie book person. It sounds like I'm complaining, but it has no effect on me. I've had a good life. I'm strangely content now. Does that come through? Something changed. Maybe it was Eugene's death. I can't complain about anything. I'm a lucky buck. Thanks.
I'm so glad someone read an interview, because I really think the Believer's interviews are first rate and the best interviews you're ever going to see with writers and artists. But onto our final reader is Steve Silberman. He is an award-winning science writer whose articles have appeared in Wired, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Financial Times, and many other publications. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, which Oliver Sacks called a sweeping and penetrating history, presented with a rare sympathy and sensitivity. Steve is currently working on a history of cystic fibrosis, The Taste of Salt, which will be published in 2022.
Hello. Oh, it's great to be here. And I'm so thankful to The Believer because my book came out in 2015, and so I've been giving talks all over the place about autism, and my book gets into stuff like the Holocaust and the social model of disability, and it's really heavy stuff. And then one day I got an email from Jeff Chang, who is the what, managing editor of The Believer or something? Editor-in-chief, yeah. And it said something like, "We want you in The Believer. What do you want to write about?" And I said, "You know, I'm obsessed with this song that Miles Davis wrote but never recorded called Nardis. I have like 150 versions on my hard drive, and I can't stop thinking about it. Can I write about that?" And he said, "Go for it." And so I wrote about that, and it came out in the last issue. So tonight, I want to read a piece by Richard Powers, who is a wonderful, deeply scientifically informed novelist and also a great guy. I spent a couple of days with him a few years ago. And this is called A Brief Take on Genetic Screening. History of current complaint. A 47-year-old white male, 6'4", 165 pounds, new to this service, presents with the chronic belief that medicine and narrative are inextricably linked. Patient has no history of delusional disorder and claims to be on no present medication. And then what happened? From the earliest campfire fable, this question has united hearers and tellers, doctors and patients, readers and writers. And from the earliest diagnostic chart, our need to know what happens next has slammed up against that classic source of dramatic tension. Knowing what's coming does not shield us from living it. We humans remember in story, anticipate in story, dream, explain, learn, and love in story. As patients, we grow ill and recover, rally and fade, all experienced as narrative excursions inside wider story frames. So it hardly diminishes the rigorous, empirical, and context-free nature of medical diagnostics to say that medical practice is a narrative art. From taking the history and physical to signing off on the postmortem notes, doctors read and then help arrange relevant clinical data into a series of causes and effects that forms a linear, time-driven story. Diagnosis and treatment are sometimes a detective novel, sometimes a domestic drama, sometimes a good old psychological character sketch. Every decent plot consists of exposition, complication, crisis, and denouement. And those 4 points on the classic tension graph define 3 regions under the curve: Aristotle's old beginning, middle, and end, but as Frank Kermode points out in The Sense of an Ending, to our eternal, private, bodily dismay, we are each born in the middle of things, live in the middle of things, and die in the middle of things. To create a more satisfying story, we do everything in our power to read into the history around us a plot more harmonically tuned to our own. By imagining how things beyond us will end, we give shape to the endless middle that we otherwise inhabit. Life is the act of revising our lives. So all good writing is rewriting. The art of medicine, too, must be a rewriter's art. Its chief goal is to open up the patient's story, to give new plot to possibility and new possibilities to the plot. But a patient's story about medicine sometimes risks imagining that its job is the elimination of all constraint. In good narrative, constraint is the mother of possibility, not possibility's opposite. When anything can happen, nothing tends to. It's only when we begin to consider all the places our own story cannot reach that we find the means to bring it to where it needs to go. At its best, predictive testing seeks to identify those plot complications and constraints that can be resolved in order to free up the patient's story and move it forward. But this is not always what we patients seek when turning to medical auguries. Something in us wants to read the determined future even as we race to write our alternatives. Today's genetic tests revive, in a rationalized, high-tech setting, the ancient obsession with divination. The same patient who has little use for such indisputable predictions as regular exercise and good diet will add to the quality of your life may still crave a glimpse of the destiny written in his nucleotide tea leaves. Something in us seeks out ironclad prophecy, the stuff of Burnham Wood and the Ides of March, readings of our pre-inscribed, inescapable fate, if only as the first step in trying to escape it. Some incurable readers stand in bookstores trying out the last pages of novels before they will plunk down good money for one. Clinical medicine, then, can leverage its own narrative nature by beginning with an artful reading of what a patient is really seeking when presented with the possibility of predictive tests. Patients who ask, "What do my numbers say?" may really be asking the very different question, "What will these numbers mean to the story I'm writing?" And as for meaning, medicine can have no definitive tests. What happens next is precisely what the doctor and patient together are about to find out. The arguments for and against genetic tests are themselves part of an unfolding story. Medicine's powers continue to change rapidly in the run of time. Our roles as characters and as authors of our own lives are undergoing a radical transformation. We live at a dangerous moment, one when the gap between our ability to make a genetic prediction and our ability to alter it is widening precariously. For the present, our clairvoyance remains contingent. The results of a given genetic test may not be valid. When they are valid, they may still tell you nothing more definitive than a probability. When they are definitive, They may cost you your insurance, your job, or your comfort and ease with friends and family. They may plunge you into depression. They may leave you with no way of changing those parts of your plot that may then obsess you. They may blind you to your own continued ability to generate and understand meaning, even in the light of fixed events. The only fully healthy patient may be the one who hasn't been fully worked up yet. Then again, tests and screens may save or extend a story. They may lift an impending sentence or indicate a life-saving prevention or treatment. Everything depends on how well we engage, not with some invariable database of external fact, but with the continuously changing private narrative at stake. The tests we devise and undergo must submit to an act of reading that complements the patient's continuous act of self-writing. Interpreting a test result is not the same as interpreting a life, but like any twist of plot, it may serve to set in motion no end of useful interpretive developments. This is the key. Genetic tests are not about escaping the story. They are about figuring out how best to be in it. The story writing component of medicine, similarly, remains the art of anticipating and identifying constraint and getting that constraint to be the start of personal possibilities, not the end. Proust writes, "We guess as we read, we create. So much begins in an initial mistake." The patient comes looking for palmistry, but the physician just as often has no more to offer than an informed weather prediction. Here's a look at what might happen next. Colder toward winter and as you head north. But as for tomorrow's temperature, it will fluctuate. Even when the physician can give a more definitive prophecy, the oracle tends to remain majestically sphinx-like until its words are lived through. Even where the results are definitive and the interpretive apparatus is solidly in place, there is still the danger of conflating prediction with explanation. Tests may read the future, but they cannot write it. Plot does not determine meaning. Readers do. The literature of prophecy constantly hinges upon a cautionary trope. The oracle or sibyl or genie will tell you an ironclad answer to the question, what will happen to me? But you won't understand the answer until it comes true. As the world's oldest writings put it, we live our lives as a tale told, somewhere between our next heartbeat and forever. The act of reading the world is the act of writing ourselves. So too with predictive medicine. It pays to keep in mind that the denouement is not the tying up. The word means, quite literally, untying. In Stuart Dybek's story, Chopin in Winter, a 5-year-old white male, sickly and short, presents with severe pneumonia. He asks his doctor if he is dying. And then what happened? Dr. Stulik put the stethoscope to my nose and listened. Not yet. This seems to me the great story advancing, possibility launching refrain of medical narrative, the thing we have no choice but to test and to know. Am I dying? Yes, but not yet. And to the question, how long do I have? Every genetic prediction ultimately returns some variation on the same answer. Not long. The end will come, but that fact, far from finishing off the meaning of the middle-bound story so far, serves to begin it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the writers who read this evening, and thank you so much for coming out to support The Believer. We have issues of The Believer for sale, and you can Esme and Steve's book are also for sale. And please join us and say hello after the program and grab another drink. So thank you so much.